Well, good morning, and it's a beautiful Saturday morning here on Cape Cod. And for my money, I can't think of a better way to spend it than by having a very robust discussion of infectious disease. I hope you're with me because this is what I really enjoy doing. I'm Larry Dapsis. I'm the Barnstable County Extension entomologist, and I've been here just about 6 years. And prior to this, I had spent 24 years in the cranberry industry with Ocean Spray. So when I entered this particular world, I entered a realm that I had no experience in. I knew nothing about Lyme disease. I really knew nothing about ticks. So what I did, I was on a vertical learning curve. And so to overcome that, I read everything I could get my mitts on. I talked with a ton of people because I had to get a sense of the landscape. What's been done, what needs to be done, and how the heck am I going to help pull this off? And what I want to do first is share with you my very first learning on this matter. Everyone hates these things, hates them with a bloody passion. There's no middle ground on this. You say the word tick, it's an instant negative emotional response. People almost make excuses for mosquitoes. They're part of the aquatic food chain, the ecosystem, but not so with ticks. And when I say everyone hates ticks, I mean everyone. So when a gentle soul like the Dalai Lama turns his back on a form of life on this planet, that's a headline. Now, a lot of you don't know that he's a pretty savvy guy. He tweeted this out one night about 3 years ago. I picked up on it, put it into my deck, and I've been following him ever since. And last summer, he shifted on this matter just a little bit. Who knew that His Holiness was such a hardcore New England Patriots fan? I absolutely love the guy. All right, so let's look at the landscape. What's been going on? This is the incidence rate of Lyme disease by state back in 2001. And as you can see from this map, Lyme is endemic to basically 14 different states. So the mid-Atlantic states, the southern Maine, then the upper central Midwest, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. But if you look at this map carefully, you see dots sprinkled all over the country. Lyme disease has been found in 49 out of 50 states. The only place it has not shown up yet is Hawaii. And this points out a couple problems. If you look at a place like Georgia that has a very, very low incidence rate, what are the chances of a doctor actually recognizing it, diagnosing you correctly, and treating you properly? It's a big roll of the dice. It's hard enough to get a good diagnosis and treatment up here. And what's been going on over time is that the incidence rates have largely been going up. And geographically, these high incidence rates are moving, okay? And with climate change, this thing is even penetrating into southern Quebec and Ontario. So it is now kind of much everywhere. And the Centers for Disease Control, they compile statistics. And what they had been doing is reporting 30,000 cases of Lyme disease year on year. And patient support groups kind of push back on that number. They're saying, how can it be 30,000? I've had Lyme, my family's had Lyme, my friends have had Lyme. How can it be 30,000? Well, the CDC basically fessed up last year, and they revised that number upward by tenfold to about 300,000 cases a year. Now it's recognized as a public health crisis. Is 300,000 the right number? Who knows? Could be 500,000, could be 1 million. One of the reasons for that is that Lyme disease is one of the most misdiagnosed infectious disease on the books because it looks like so many other things. Depending on the background of the attending physician, to one doctor it might look like fibromyalgia or multiple sclerosis or chronic fatigue syndrome. It's in your head, you're crazy, and all of those things happen. All right, and it's not just a North American problem. Lyme has been found and is endemic in 80 different countries around the world. So this isn't something that sprung up in Lyme, Connecticut 40 years ago and radiated out. This is not a new disease. It's a re-emerging disease. So it's been on this planet for tens of thousands of years. All right, if we look at the map a little more closely, we see that Vermont and Maine have the highest incidence rate of Lyme in the country. And they're always up there. Some years it's Maine, some years it's Vermont. When this 3-year average was calculated, Massachusetts, we were number 5. The previous time this was calculated, we were number 3. If you look at the right-hand side of those numbers, that's a pretty tight grouping. Just takes a few cases one way or the other to kind of shift who's where. But what's really noteworthy here is that all 6 New England states occupy the highest incidence rates in the country. So if there's any question whether we're living at ground zero, this kind of takes that off the table immediately. If we look at this by county in the state, we see that Nantucket and Dukes County, Martha's Vineyard, they have the highest incidence rates of Lyme disease basically in the visible universe. And there's some interesting ecological reasons and some behavioral reasons for that. Barnstable County, we're number 4. Historically, we were number 3 for many, many, many years. And when these data came out in 2014, Plymouth County passed Cape Cod by a big margin. And I know when I get this next set of data, Bristol County's going to pass us and drop us into number 5. This is the race we're losing. And that's good. And these trends got the attention of people at the Harvard School of Medicine. They were looking at these data and they were seeing each county in the state, the incidence rate of Lyme disease is climbing like this, okay? The exception of Barnstable County. We're flat as a tabletop. And that baffled them. And they started probing, asking some questions about what's so different about Cape Cod? What the heck is going on out there? And when they probed this and asked some questions, they found out that we're the only county in the state that has a super aggressive outreach program. And we've had this for a number of years now, and it's clearly taking traction. Well, one of the doctors, Dr. David Scale, is a freelance writer. And what he has started doing is publishing a series of stories for NPR Boston. He's now produced 4 of them. It's about the problem overall, but also kind of, aspects of what we're doing here on Cape Cod to help protect ourselves. All right. Let's look at the different players people might encounter on the Cape, okay? This is the American dog tick. Some people call this the wood tick. And for a number of us that are older, this is a tick basically we remember growing up with. We didn't have deer ticks and Lyme disease. I grew up in Worcester, and if we had deer ticks and Lyme disease and the way I spent my youth out in the woods, the swamps, the meadows, I probably would have been, had Lyme disease about 50 times, and we'd be having this presentation through a Ouija board, okay? I consider this tick more of an annoyance than a public health threat, even though it can vector the pathogens that cause Rocky Mountain spotted fever and tularemia. Both of those can be quite serious. But in Massachusetts, those 2 diseases are very, very rare. This is the newest comer to Cape Cod, the Lone Star tick. And we'll get into some information in a few minutes. This is a very, very different tick. This creature has been moving north for a number of years. There's a number of ecologists that think this is a function of climate change. We're seeing plants and animals in places we never used to see them before. And up until a few years ago, the northernmost established points were Cuttyhunk and Noshawn Islands off the west coast of Martha's Vineyard. Well, 3 years ago, with the help of Cape Cod Mosquito Control, I was called out to Sandy Neck Beach Park because people were seeing a different tick. They said they knew what deer ticks were and they knew dog ticks, but this wasn't either one. And I went out to that area, and that's a 6-mile long peninsula, and I found Lone Star ticks from one end to the other. They basically own that piece of real estate, and they've been moving out ever since. I think what happened is this was probably introduced by migratory birds, which birds and ticks are great hitchhikers, and birds are a useful way to move them around. And it's been showing up in other parts of the Cape. Last fall, I was called out to the Shining Sea Bikeway. I found an established population out there as well. And Cape Cod Mosquito Control is basically their crews are picking them up in most of the towns on the Cape. So I think what's happened is once the migratory birds established it, we have a number of animals on the ground that are probably moving this around as well. Things like our friend the wild turkey and coyotes and other things. All right, this is a very different tick in the fact that it's an aggressive biter, okay? This tick has excellent vision and they can run. They're like little Ferraris. And if they see you, they will chase you. They will actually hunt you down like a coyote on a bunny. And so while they don't vector the pathogens that cause Lyme, they have their own set of diseases. Ehrlichiosis and tularemia, those two can be quite serious. Stari is a type of rash disease with flu-like symptoms, not too bad, pretty easy to clear up. We've only found this pathogen for Stari in some of the ticks that have been analyzed on the Cape, so the pathogens are coming behind. Now, this tick, the adult female, she lays her ticks in an egg mass, about 4,000 or 5,000 eggs. And those things hatch into tiny little larvae August into September. So you end up with these very high concentrations of these little ticks. And if you're walking along and you bump into one, generally you meet most of the family. And within minutes, you can get 200 or 300 bites. And the problem with this, it's already been misdiagnosed in some of the ERs. Some of the doctors here in the Cape are passing this off as chiggers. Well, there's a big problem with that. We don't have chiggers in Massachusetts. So we've informed the medical community through Cape Cod Healthcare that of what's going on here. And those little bites, those are actually individual ticks that are attached. And they will bother you. The scratching and itching and things like that will last for 6 or 7 weeks. And the other thing about this tick, the real joker in the deck, is that the bite of a Lone Star tick can trigger an allergy to red meat consumption. And this allergic response can be as mild as hives all the way to anaphylactic shock. And I know for a fact that we've had cases of this occur on the Cape already. And it's not just beef, but it's pork, lamb, and even beef byproducts like beef-derived gelatin. And if you think about the processed food products that we eat, beef-derived gelatin is in a lot of different things, including the marshmallows that we feed our children. All right. This is still the main player, the deer tick, and for reasons we'll get into in a couple minutes, the proper name for this tick is really the black-legged tick. All right, deer ticks. Unlike Lone Star ticks, these creatures don't run. They're an ambush predator, and they have this behavior called questing. And so if you look at this adult stage female tick on top of this piece of vegetation, she's got her front legs extended upwards. And what she's doing is sampling her environment. She has an organ in the front of her legs that can sense changes in the concentration of carbon dioxide. So if you're strolling along and with your pooch and you're both presumably breathing, you're changing the concentration of carbon dioxide around you, and she can detect that. She can detect changes in temperature, like body heat, and she can detect vibration. So while she can't see you, she knows exactly what's going on around her, and she'll orient to those stimuli and maybe even start to move towards them. And at the end of those legs is this beautiful little claw. All you have to basically do is touch that. It will attach and start climbing up and looking for a place to have dinner. All right, so let's look at the hardware. On the far left here, that's an adult deer tick. The picture in the middle, that's a deer tick head under a microscope. Those appendages on either side of the tick's head, those are called palps. That's what the tick uses to taste you and see if you're worthy of becoming the blue plate special that night. If you are, it'll take these things. These are called chelicerae. And these are like little scalpel blades with hooks. So what that tick does is it basically makes an incision, hook in, and pull. So it's kind of like doing the breaststroke. And with each motion, it's driving this beak of a mouth part down deeper and deeper through your skin. And if we look at that under a microscope, that's pretty impressive stuff. That thing is fairly long with respect to its overall body size, but it has these beautiful recurved barbs. So this thing is designed to stay for a while. So if you're ever trying to remove a tick and you see your skin popping up and you feel like you're ripping out your flesh, it's because you are, all right? Now, a tick doesn't start sucking blood immediately. The first thing a tick does is it injects you with tick spit. And tick spit's fascinating to a scientist like me. It contains all kinds of biologically active ingredients and other compounds. And one of the things in tick spit is cement. That thing not only has the barbs, but it'll glue itself in place. And it'll secrete anticoagulants, keep your blood from clotting, vasodilators, increase the flow of blood to the point of attachment, and it'll secrete chemicals to deaden your nerves, because that thing wants to remain undisturbed, because from start to finish, that tick might be on you for 4 or 5 days before it's fully fed. And so that tick will go through cycles of sucking blood and spitting, and sucking blood and spitting, and when it's done, it'll secrete an enzyme, dissolve that glue, back itself out, go on its merry way, and may have left you with a couple presents. All right, why the name deer tick is a misnomer. This thing has been documented to be associated with over 125 different vertebrate hosts. So it's not just about the deer, it's not just about the mice. This is a very complex ecosystem, a lot of moving parts. Now the rodents do play a key role here. Things like mice are what we call competent hosts. What that means is that mice and chipmunks and squirrels and rats, they have the ability to harbor the Lyme disease bacteria and transmit that back into the tick population. So it's kind of like microbial ping pong here, all right? Birds play a role. We'd already talked about migratory birds, kind of moving ticks around as hitchhikers. But there's some birds that are actually reservoir hosts for that Lyme disease bacteria. Things like our American robin and our old friend, the wild turkey, great reservoir host. And then we've got a bunch of animals that are incompetent hosts. They cannot infect a tick. So things like deer and coyotes and raccoons and dogs, they can't infect a tick. But what they can do is supply dinner and kind of help keep that population going. All right. The risk of infection is basically year-round, okay? But the greatest risk isn't where you might think it is based on the data we have. It's not from these adult stage ticks. They're coming out right now, and they'll be with us through the spring. And in our research, we find on average 50% of them are packing the pathogen that causes Lyme. But that's a larger stage of the tick, and you're more likely to detect that bite. The greatest risk of infection, it's from this nymph stage tick that's out in late May to early August. And in our research, we find that, 25% of them are packing the bug that causes Lyme. But that's a smaller stage of the tick, and you're less likely to detect that bite. So we get a large stage of the tick and a small stage. So how do we convey that to people in a way that they can construct a search image when they're doing your tick checks? So we came up with this bagel topping analogy. An adult stage tick is about the size of a sesame seed. That nymph stage tick, yeah, they're the size of a poppy seed, okay? So something the size of a poppy seed that has 8 legs, a bad attitude, and can plant you on your butt for a very, very long time. And we see this reflected in the case data, okay? This is incidence rate of Lyme disease by month. And this slide shows actually a couple different things. One of the questions I get generally from people is that, Larry, when's tick season? And I say, well, it starts in January, goes to December, and picks up again in January. Anytime you get temperatures above freezing and a break in snow cover, you're going to have tick activity. So you see cases of Lyme disease each and every month. But when you look at during the summer, when that nymph stage tick is out, the size of a poppy seed, they're responsible for 85% of all tick-borne diseases. So that is a stage we want to communicate to people in a time frame that we really want people to be extra vigilant. All right, and not everybody's affected equally. This is Lyme disease by age group. So on the far left, those are kids under age 5. Kids age 5 to 9 have the highest incidence rate of Lyme disease in the state. So whatever we've been doing as parents up to this point clearly is not working. We've got to rethink the game plan and be prepared to do things differently and change our behaviors. Then the incidence rate is lower for people in their 20 and 30 somethings. People are starting families, they're starting careers, there's not as much time devoted to outdoor activities. And as we get older, we get more spare time. So things like golf and gardening, and ticks and gardening go hand in hand. So we see this other peak for people in their 60s. So we have what we call a bimodal distribution of data. And with the data that we're now accumulating from UMass Amherst, the Laboratory of Medical Zoology, those are the two groups of people that are getting most of the tick bites. All right, winners. This is a perennial question I get every spring from the media in particular. Larry, we had a brutal, harsh winter. What did that do to the tick populations? And my pat answer is absolutely nothing. Now, when you get a hard freeze, people associate that with the end of mosquito season, and that's certainly true, but not so with ticks. And when people talk to me about a harsh winter, I don't find the Cape Cod winters to be particularly harsh, okay? It's a matter of perspective. When I was ocean spray, I spent 24 years traveling to Wisconsin, where I was known by the name Sven, okay? Wisconsin has real winters, okay? 25 below zero for extended periods of time is not all that unusual. And I think this is why, or confirms why Wisconsin has the highest per capita consumption of brandy in the country. But in Wisconsin, deer ticks are quite happy, and Wisconsin's quite endemic for Lyme disease. And there's a very fascinating reason for this. People discovered that ticks synthesize a chemical called glycerol. Well, what the heck is glycerol? Well, glycerol is antifreeze, okay? And so while the glycerol prevents ice crystal formation in the cells, and that's what causes tissue damage, they also found that the Lyme disease bacteria feeds on the glycerol as a source of energy for itself. So this is one fascinating, perfectly engineered little package. All right, 25 years ago or so, we would have put the period on the page here with Lyme disease and started talking about some other topics like prevention and things like that. But the tick-borne disease landscape has been changing steadily, and it's even shifted in the last couple of years. We have a second disease, babesiosis, and this is a parasite that invades your red blood cells, okay? So this is kind of like getting malaria. And as with malaria, your symptoms include cycles of fever and chills, and you generally get severely anemic because as this parasite's reproducing, your red blood cells are blowing up like little water balloons. And unlike Lyme disease, babesiosis can be directly fatal, okay? So it's pretty serious stuff. And we also know now that you can get babesiosis from a blood transfusion. So the blood handling centers have scrambled to try and figure out how do you screen the quality of the blood supply. Well, right now, the only way that they can do this is through a questionnaire. You go to donate blood, there'll be a questionnaire, have you ever had babesiosis? You check the yes box, you get your cranberry oatmeal cookie and a cup of apple juice, and they send you on your merry way. You're never allowed to donate blood ever again. Now, there's a diagnostics lab that has developed a protocol for testing for this, and now that's submitted to FDA and it's in their court, so we'll see what happens. And where do we find this thing? Yeah, southeastern Massachusetts. This thing is increasing, and over half the cases in the state occur on the Cape and the islands. But this has now been found to some extent in every single county in the state. So this is probably what the map of Lyme disease looked like, 35 years ago. It started out on the Cape and the islands and spread out across the Commonwealth. So here's our third disease, anaplasmosis. This is a parasite that invades one type of your white blood cells, your granulocytes. And if you look at those symptoms, the fever, the nausea, the headache, muscle pain, abdominal pain, confusion, brain fog, a lot of those can look like the symptoms of Lyme disease. So if you're working with a physician and they're thinking maybe you have Lyme disease, but you're not flipping a positive test, and a lot of people don't because the test is very unreliable. And some doctors may choose not to treat you until you flip a positive test. You might have something completely different going on here. And we certainly have our hotspots of this on the Cape and the Islands, but this is more broadly distributed. So as you can see, Boston Metro West, the North Shore, And for whatever reason, I don't know, southern Berkshire County is overrun with this. They are screaming for help, and help is not coming to them. They don't know what to tell people about this. And the age distribution of this is very different from Lyme. These two diseases are rarely found in younger people. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but it's not that common. But you get to be 60 years old and older, that's where 95% of the cases reside. All right, now we're up to number 4. A few years ago, we were notified that we've had cases of Borrelia miyamotoi here on the Cape, and now it's being called relapsing fever. And this is related to the Lyme disease bacteria. So you see in this picture that bacteria, it looks like a piece of fusilli-shaped pasta. Well, that's called a spirochete. And this pathogen, or the organism's been known about for some time, but the first linkage to human disease was established only very recently over in Russia. Once they published their findings, they started seeing cases in the United States. And I know for a fact that Cape Cod Hospital has diagnosed and treated people for relapsing fever. When we looked at the tick population, we're finding it in about 3% of the ticks. So it's out there at a very low level, but it's probably going to follow the pattern of these other emerging diseases as time goes on. Now we're up to number 5. I was notified a couple of years ago by Department of Public Health. We've had 13 cases of Powassan virus in the state. And they know for a fact it was from tick bites that did occur in Massachusetts. It occurred during the summer months and the fall, so it implies that the nymph stage as well as the adult stage deer ticks are carrying this thing. And the clinical presentation is typically encephalitis or meningitis, swelling of the brain and spinal tissues. And of these 13 cases, 3 were fatal. And 2 of those fatalities were here on Cape Cod. So what we did was we wanted to find out how prevalent is this pathogen here on the Cape. And so I partnered, and I've been partners with the Laboratory of Medical Zoology at UMass Amherst for 6 years now. So on the far left, that's Dr. Steve Rich. He's the director of the laboratory. To the right is his research associate, Guang Zhu. He is basically Master Yoda of this analytical technique that we use. And in the center, that's Emily, one of Steve's graduate students. So we set up surveillance last year. We sampled ticks from Falmouth, Barnstable, Brewster, Harwich, Orleans, and Truro. So we cast a wide net. And we thought we were looking for a needle in a haystack, because my friend and colleague, Gabby Sokolsky at Mosquito Control, she'll test hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of mosquitoes before she comes up with a detect of West Nile virus. We thought we were looking about the same thing. When we got our data, we were actually quite astonished. We found Powassan-infected ticks at 4 out of the 6 sites, ranging from Falmouth all the way out to Truro. And as you can see at Truro, we have infection rates as high as 10%. And so as we thought about this, we have a relatively high rate of infection in tick populations with very low number of cases of people getting sick that we know of. And so we're looking at this now through the lens of West Nile virus. It appears that a lot of people can be exposed to the virus and be completely asymptomatic, which means you don't get sick. In the rare instances where this thing goes neuroinvasive, that's when things get very dicey and you're in the hospital very quickly. All right, we have a 3-phase protection plan we talk about. Protect yourself, protect your yard, and protect your pets. So I look at this as my job is to basically take business away from doctors and hospitals, okay? I'm in the family protection racket. So here's an average family on Cape Cod. Okay, this is likely Woods Hole. You know what it's like down there, and they need protection from tick-borne diseases as well as from themselves. All right, proper removal. The proper tool for removing a tick is pointy tweezers, not big fat tweezers, because ticks have hundreds of different kinds of bacteria in their guts. So if you crush that tick, you just might give yourself a really nasty infection. So it's not the dish detergent or the Vaseline or the flaming match trick, it's the pointy tweezers. So you just grab that tick by the head as close to your skin as you can get and just gently pry up. You don't have to be Arnold Schwarzenegger and rip it out at 100 miles an hour. Just gentle upward straight pressure and that thing will pop. I tell people to record the date. I think it's important to timeline these events because the symptoms of something like Lyme disease might show up in 3 days, might take 30 or more. So you write the date down, you knew you were bitten by a tick, you're not feeling good. Now you actually have a starting point for a conversation with your doctor. I ask people if they saved the tick, and most people have not, okay, up to fairly recently. And most people, they flush it. That's the #1 answer. But I've had some people tell me, Larry, I just put that thing in the microwave till it exploded. So some people take these things very personally. The reason for saving the tick is, like with our research ticks, you can get that tick tested at UMass Amherst. And so you just go to tickreport.com. There's an online submission process, very easy. If you get stuck, there's a little chat button that monitor that very quickly. And when you send them the tick and they receive it, once they get the tick, you're going to have your results back in 3 business days, guaranteed, okay? And unlike the human blood test for something like Lyme disease, this is 99.99% accurate. So let's look at a couple examples. If you go to tickreport.com and click on statistics, put in a zip code like your town, it'll pull up the test results for all the ticks that were tested in that zip code, okay? So I pulled up a couple that I thought were kind of interesting. This is a tick report from a 3-year-old boy up in Norwell, and this tick was attached to his head. And when the lab gets the tick, they'll assess the feeding status, or the state of engorgement. And in this case, this tick was fully engorged, meaning this tick was attached to this kid's head for 4, if not 5 days. I'm not sure how that happens, but it did. So that's plenty of time for transmission of these pathogens. We have basically a 24-hour rule of thumb for most of these things, that if it's on you for less than 24 hours, the risk of transmission is low. Doesn't mean it's 0, but it's low. And after 24 hours, the risk of transmission ramps up. Now, the exception to this is Powassan virus. The transmission rate of Powassan is 15 minutes. So let's look at what this tick had. This tick tested positive for Borrelia burgdorferi. That's the bacteria that causes Lyme disease. So without medical intervention, this kid likely would have came down with Lyme disease. But this tick was co-infected, and we see this with a fair amount of frequency. The tick was tested positive for Babesia. So what we said earlier, young people, babesiosis is very rare, but it can occur. And so what would the combination of these 2 pathogens look like to a doctor? So these data provide a benefit 2 ways. One, for the patient, now you have hard data, hard, accurate data that you can present to your doctor and say, hey, I was potentially exposed to this, and I was potentially exposed to this. For the doctor, now they have actually some data to show that what are the types of things they should be looking for in their patient. So I know the doctors on the Cape, they're warming up to this as a useful diagnostic tool. Here, let's look at a second one. This is a woman out in Eastham. She hit the lottery. She was positive on every single thing we were looking for, and that tick was partially fed. So what might that look like to a doctor? So we're a big supporter of this program, and it's been subsidized actually for the last couple of years through the generous support of Cape Cod Healthcare. Normally a full panel test is $50. With the grants we've received from Cape Cod Healthcare, for the past 2 years for Cape residents, it's been $15. So basically for the price of a pizza, you get some really good data. And they've since funded it further, basically kind of bridge funding till we find out a long-term solution of getting this to a point where people don't have to even think about sending it off to get tested. All right, among the things that protect yourself, boilerplate recommendation is long pants tucked in the socks. Well, I've been working here on Cape Cod for 6 years, and I see people making some pretty bold fashion statements, but you guys aren't making this one, but it's certainly effective. If you wear light colors, makes it easier to see the tick. I tell people when you come in from an outdoor activity, throw your clothes in the dryer for 20 minutes. 20 minutes will kill any ticks on there. You see in some recommendations, put your clothes through the washer, then the dryer on high heat for an hour. Well, research I read about 7 weeks ago showed that ticks can go through a wash cycle quite successfully, okay? The only thing that happens to them is they come out nice and shiny before you throw them in the dryer and kill them. The importance of real shoes, that should be obvious, okay? When I'm sampling in a place like Nickerson State Park, which parts of that park are pretty tick heavy, and I see people coming down the trail wearing flip-flops, I absolutely cringe. And I do have a word with them. I talk a lot to people about repellents as a first line defense. And repellents come in a couple different flavors, all right? This group up here on top, the DEETs or the DEET alternatives like picaridin or oil of lemon eucalyptus, those are for treating exposed skin. So what that means is that tick won't bite you where that repellent is, but it just might keep marching along until it finds a place where there's no repellent and have a little feast. Then we have this group here on the bottom, the all natural products. And these things resonate, particularly with parents. I'm using something safe and effective for my kids, and nothing could be further from the truth. Here's the difference between these two groups. Group on top, those are EPA registered, okay? If it's on the label it repels ticks and mosquitoes for 6 hours, there are data on file at EPA to support that claim. This group on the bottom, they're EPA registration exempt, meaning they don't have to provide a shred of evidence that they work at all. And in doing some of my research on these products and looking at the active ingredients that they're using, a number of them are known human allergens, and there's been documented cases of these things interacting negatively with sunscreens, okay? So my message to parents is pretty clear. These all natural products, get them out. Got to start using some real impactful stuff here. There's another repellent that a lot of people weren't familiar with when I came on board that contains the active ingredient permethrin. And this is for treating clothing, so your pants, your socks, and your footwear. And this will keep its activity through 6 washings because permethrin's not that water soluble. And treating footwear is mission critical, okay? And here's why. Those little nymph stage ticks that cause 85% of all diseases, they're down in the leaf litter, okay? The first place they attach to are your shoes. And when I started doing my initial research with this product, what I found is that if a tick is on a treated surface for 60 seconds, on average that tick is going to be dead in 9 minutes. This is the most effective tool in the box. I wear it year round, okay? Biggest problem when I came here was finding the product. If you knew about it, the only place that did have it was Eastern Mountain Sports. So I've talked to all the major garden centers on the Cape, and they now are stocking product. And I do store checks. I talk to the managers, and I say, okay, are you selling product? And right now, they're out of stock more than in stock. So the word is getting out there, and that's very, very good. And there are several different formulations. There's aerosols, and then there's this water-based pump spray. They're both, you know, same products. I like the water-based pump spray myself. I think it gives a very good spray pattern. Occasionally, there's a problem with the aerosols that they run out of propellant before they empty the container of product. But either way, use them. And you can also buy pre-treated clothing. Insect Shield down in North Carolina dominated this market for years. They actually created it. And more recently, there's a woman in Maine who has a business, No Fly Zone, similar technology. It keeps its activity through 70 washings, basically the life of the garment. And you can also buy insect repellent clothing from companies like Orvis or LL Bean, but Insect Shield's in the private label business. So if you bought it from Bean, came from Insect Shield. The third way you can skin this cat, you can send your favorite gardening clothes, for example, to Insect Shield. They'll treat them and send them back to you with the same 70 washings claim. And it's a modest cost. It's about $10 a garment. So that's the other way you can do this. All right, this is my elephant in the room slide, because particularly with parents, they're concerned about me recommending them to put their kids in clothing treated with a synthetic chemical pesticide. And okay, I can understand that. But I'll talk to you with the facts about permethrin toxicity. A basic tenet of modern toxicology, it's not the molecule, it's the dose that makes the poison, okay? How much you were exposed to and what was the route of exposure. Was it oral, was it dermal, was it inhalation? They all mean different things. Well, permethrin has very low mammalian toxicity, with the exception of kitty cats. They are sensitive to this product, but everything else tolerates it quite well. Permethrin's over 2,000 times more toxic to a tick than a person. People are big, ticks are little, doesn't take a whole lot to do that. EPA did develop a position. They have reasonable certainty that permethrin-treated clothing poses no harm to infants, children, pregnant women, or nursing mothers. And their criteria certainly would be conservative. And here's the big reason for this. Permethrin is in a class of insecticides that has very low dermal absorption, okay? There are some other classes of insecticides like the phosphates, diazinon. You get it on your skin, it mainlines into your bloodstream, it's on your way to your nervous system, but not so with this group. And whatever small amount is absorbed is metabolized very quickly. The metabolites in human testing show that these things show up in urine a couple hours later. National Academy of Sciences, that is not a lightweight organization at all. They were wondering about long-term exposure effects. So when they set up a study, they were looking at people wearing permethrin-treated clothing, everything, 18 hours a day, every single day for 10 years. And when they rolled up that aggregate exposure, they saw no reason to expect an adverse effect. And finally, what I tell people is that this is the active ingredient that you would literally slather on an infant at a much higher concentration for scabies mite. And it's the active ingredient used to treat head lice, which is making a comeback in our school system. So from my standpoint, when I look at what I think is a relatively low risk cup of exposure to permethrin, and I weigh that against the consequences of one of these tick-borne illnesses, for me, that is really easy math, and you need to consider that. All right, protect your yard. You are not going to find deer ticks out in the middle of an open lawn. Short grass, direct sunlight, low humidity, absolutely hostile for ticks. We're finding Lone Star ticks actually can tolerate these conditions, so it's going to have to make us think about our yard strategy as they become more abundant. But you get a transition zone from the edge of the lawn where it might be in partial shade, and then you're transitioning into brush and trees and leaf litter, places that have relatively high humidity. That's where you're going to find the ticks. And if you think about those environmental conditions, those woody ornamental plantings at the edge of your house, yeah, they provide the same conditions. The leaf litter, the shade, the humidity. You can find ticks in those areas as well. So as a 1-2 punch, I recommend the permethrin treating clothing and footwear, and then consider a perimeter yard spray, okay? And the timing for this, I recommend mid to late May, mid to late June, and then again mid-October, so you cover all the windows of activity. And you can hire companies now that'll do this as a service. A lot of them use products like permethrin, bifenthrin usually, called Telstar. They work about the same. There's some all-natural solutions that are being marketed out there. There's no evidence that those things provide any measure of control at all, so I basically kind of wave those off. Or you can do this thing yourself and save yourself a bunch of money. You can go to any garden center. There's a product line under the Bonide label, and so the product you would be looking for is Bonide 8. So it's a hose end sprayer. So you just hook it up to your garden hose, it'll dilute it to the right concentration. All you have to do is point and spray, and you are good to go. And finally, pet protection, okay? So you have animals that tend to like to go outdoors. When they come back inside, if it's possible, do a tick check. That's a good thing. There's a number of over-the-counter products now available, typically these monthly topicals like Frontline or Canine Advantix 2. And those are effective. Canine Advantix 2 seems to perform a lot better than the Frontline. But for a number of people, the monthly topical thing kind of gets old after a while. Did I remember to do it? Do I feel like doing it? So the manufacturer of Canine Advantix 2 came up with an alternative product a couple of years ago, a Seresto collar. and you put this collar on your animal, you get 8 continuous months of flea and tick control, okay? And I've talked with a number of people that have swapped over from Advantix 2 to the collar. Very, very happy. And if you do the math, this collar is cheaper in the long run. So the upfront cost might be $65 or so, but if you look at that over time, it is way cheaper way to protect your animal. So what we've done over the last 6 years, we've simplified the game plan, okay? If you look at a lot of traditional extension programs, they might recommend 8 to 10 things to do. And people are so busy today. We have information flying at us from 100 different directions. If I gave you a list of 8 things to do, you probably wouldn't do any of them. If I give you 3 things to do that you could implement today, that's a different story. Tick checks and the use of permethrin-treated clothing, you do that alone, you've reduced your chances of getting a tick bite by 90%. The perimeter yard spray is part of a 1-2 punch, and pet protection, 1, 2, 3. It's that easy. So while these tick-borne diseases, as horrible as they can be, life-threatening or at the very least life-altering, the silver lining in this whole thing is that they're all preventable. And with that, we'll close the presentation. My contact information, if you want to get a hold of me, is 508-375-6642 or ldapsis@barnstablecounty.org. Thank you for spending time with us this morning, and stay tick safe.